Ekwow, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you so much.
Yes, you are the chairman of the Africa Education Trust Fund.
Correct.
Which is huge. Tell me more about that.
Well, the Africa Education Trust Fund has been created by a group of Africans to champion the issues related to Africa's educational challenges and opportunities. Basically, it's a way of aggregating resources from all corners of Africa and the globe, mostly the private sector, but also public sector resources, both financial and non-financial, to generate opportunities for more Africans to be educated.
Nice.
And so it's a global opportunity for anyone and everyone who believes in improving Africa's educational and human resource capabilities.
Thanks for that, and I love that initiative. And my first question when you say that is, we can aggregate the funds, but how do we better manage and make sure those funds are being used and implemented?
Excellent. Now, this question actually goes to the heart of how and why the fund has been created. You know, traditionally, most of Africa's education currently is funded by governments. But historically, going back 200-300 years, when the colonialists were beginning formal education in Africa,
Yes.
it was mostly the missionaries who came to provide Western-style formal education.
Okay.
Africans had their own traditional, oral, historical ways of passing knowledge from one family or one father to the next generation. But formal education of sitting in classrooms and earning a certificate is a Western white person's idea of education. Now, from that period, the colonialists had, as I said, the religious bodies were the first Catholics, Presbyterians, and other ecumenical Christian denominations. Then, of course, the Muslims also had their various Makaranta type Islamic education systems. When African countries became independent of colonial rule, the newly installed African governments, the states then began to take more active interest in improving education as a means of catalyzing development and opportunities for the countries. So the state has become dominant in most African countries. But more in recent years, the private sector has begun to also assert itself as the regulatory environment has eased up and governments have realized that they alone do not have the resources to educate everybody who needs education. So gradually, African governments have also made it possible for the private sector to run what the private sector always used to do were in the elementary schools, kindergartens, creches, those are usually private, and then some primary schools, but eventually at the secondary school level where the state has been dominant, and also at the tertiary level, universities and polytechnics, where again the state has been dominant, there's been liberalization, and private companies have also been allowed to enter and create their own private institutions. However, there has not been much coherence in terms of the subject matter relevance. So in many African countries, almost anybody who has money can create any kind of education institution and advertise it and get people to enroll to get a paper certificate, which may not get them any employment afterwards. But there's very little coordination at the national level in terms of, if you were to start a country afresh and you are put in charge of education, you would ask yourself questions such as, what kind of graduates do we need in this country? And what kind of backgrounds do those graduates need to have in terms of whether they'll be lawyers, economists, bankers, engineers, doctors, and what have you? This question is not being asked in most African countries. So many countries are just graduating people based on who can pay.
Okay, so how are we implementing those funds? So I like the history, how we say, when we westernized with our education system back in Africa, but like, how do we implement? You started with saying you aggregated the funds, but now what are we using the funds for?
So Africa Education Trust Fund is a means of improving the allocation of funds, because the Africa Education Trust Fund, which has an ambition to mobilize hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10, 20 years, the way with which the money will be channeled will help countries to, rationalize.
Do we have those ways? Do we know those ways?
Well, the ways have to be democratic, but money has a way of changing people's behavior. Because the person who is giving you the money give you the rules of what to do with the money. And right now, since governments have a very interesting way of collecting money from the private sector. Most people think governments are the ones who are funding education in Africa or any part of the world.
But it's really, you'll say the private
The
sector.
private sector is the one who gives the money to the government through taxes. And the government takes that money that the same private sector has given to them and then gives it back
And
in
that's a
any
problem.
kind of projects. But in the process, government takes out percentages.
And that's the problem.
Both the individuals and institutions carve out some percentages for themselves, often illegally, improperly, corruptly, and then give only 70, 50% back into the system. But through the African Education Trust Fund, the private sector has the opportunity now to give directly to the educational system and get directly the benefits through the employment of the outputs of the
So it's direct implementation versus going through the government.
Through an often corrupt and very unstructured system to get the wrong results.
I love that. I have two more questions. One, you told me that you're Ghanaian. So are we doing this only in Ghana, or you have expanded, or?
No, Africa. The word is Africa.
It is Africa. Sure, you're
even though Ghana is the headquarters of the fund for now, the headquarters of the organization has obviously a Pan-African and a global objective. So even Ghanaians or Africans that are living in the diaspora can also gain additional, support from the fund when it's established. It's still in the process of being established.
Yes.
So the rules of operations, the criteria, the eligibility, who can apply, who can qualify, all those things are still being worked out.
Gotcha.
But we intend for it to invest in those parts of African education that are currently least invested in, such as vocational and technical education, and also especially early childhood education.
Yes.
The first 6 to 9 years of education, according to psychologists and experts, are where the human being really has the greatest opportunity to, be prepared for the 70 years ahead of them. If they don't get good early foundational education, the rest of their lives are,
it's like
somehow mismatched.
So thanks for that. So when we talk about, making Africa more competitive, why education specifically?
Well, we believe education is foundational to human development. Whether you get your education through your family, initial family values, the first 3, 4, 5 years, and even the first 10 years, even for many people, all of their lives is the foundation that your parents give to you. The ethical foundations, what is good and what is bad, things that without knowing you will always go the wrong way.
Yes.
Those are important. Then when it comes to early childhood education, in terms of your creches or your kindergartens and any place that will give you the initial A, B, C, D knowledge.
It's a foundational.
Those are the foundations.
Yeah.
Then of course you go to primary, secondary schools, etc. So without any kind of education or formal education, which unfortunately many African countries don't have more than 50% literacy. In many African countries, there's more than 50% illiteracy.
Wow.
And the countries that even have more than 50% literacy, the kind of education that most of their citizens have is not necessarily directly relevant to the economy. So a country that like Ghana, which has a lot of cocoa, most people grow up without ever learning a subject of cocoa production. Many African countries have not learned much about agricultural production. And yet Africa is an agricultural, agronomic country, or mining. You don't learn anything about the natural resources of your country, but that's what the colonialists established. They didn't want us to know how our own economies and countries are managed and how our resources are processed and all of that. So we've been blindsided. And even after we gain our independence, 70, 60 years later, educational systems have not fully captured what we need to know in order to develop our countries.
And that's your mission.
So if you find out how many engineers are in a particular country, you wonder, why not? How many engineering schools, how many medical schools?
Yes.
And the brains of Africans can learn any subject. But the subject matter decision making is often related to who can pay and how much quickly the business person or even the government which has established their schools can get people to graduate.
Yes.
So people take the easy way out, just to get a piece of paper and say, I've got this certificate, so give me a job.
Yes.
But we want to divert and direct African education towards the particular subject matter that will get Africa to be more industrialized, that will get Africa to be more export-oriented, that will get Africans to be more competitive globally.
Yes.
So that we can compete with the Asians, we can compete with the Americans.
We're already competing. We just need more implementation.
The human beings are there.
Yeah.
And we are the youngest continent on the planet. We'll also have the largest workforce in the next 10, 20 years, but we are not as well prepared to generate the productivity that is needed because the educational system is still badly structured. And AETF, Africa Education Trust Fund, is there to help to restructure that by giving the proper incentives, the proper funding to go to the right places to produce a new crop of Africans who can compete with anybody else on the world stage.
Well said. Thank you so much, sir, for being with me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.